Hello, welcome to Curious Minds, straight from the comforts of my own home, just like everybody else out there. Still here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is a Christian apologetics podcast, so need to take a Christian apologetics look at things like the coronavirus and different things that shape the culture, shape the way that the world is thinking nowadays. And last week, talked about how different Christians are responding to the coronavirus, touched a little bit on the problem of evil. We'll do that again toward the close of this one. But first, I want to shape the issue around what some people are saying about the coronavirus. One is Greg Laurie, one Joseph Prince, and some other unnamed pastors that are doing their thing. Greg Laurie said, maybe the fear and panic surrounding the coronavirus is actually worse than the coronavirus itself. What do you think of that? To be determined. I think we'll reflect back on this time years down the road, and it will be a very fascinating piece of history. Greg Laurie also believes that there are practical steps that Christians need to take to resolve the issue of the virus. Just like the others are saying, the same kind of measures. Laurie also said a Christian is indestructible until God is done with them. What do you think of that? What do you think of that in light of the coronavirus? A Christian is indestructible until God is done with them. Yet there are practical steps you can take to resolve the virus. Those seem to be two sort of conflicting ideas. It's as if he is saying there is a human responsibility side, but there's also a God sovereignty side. And if you as a Christian take the mentality of, I'm indestructible until God says I will be taken, that can lead to some poor decisions. What if I were to go out my door and jump off the balcony and say, you know what? I'll only be as hurt as God wants me to be. Not a good idea. How did Jesus respond to that? Remember, Jesus was tempted by the devil. The devil said, hey, throw yourself off this cliff because God said he'll protect you. But Jesus said, don't put the Lord your God to the test. Apparently, for Jesus, there were not excuses to make poor decisions because you're calling yourself faithful. And that seems to be a little bit of what we're seeing in the culture. Christians can get a bad rap if they claim faith and they displace wise decision-making in the name of faith. Well, that is not what I'm promoting. I think well-informed faith is the best way forward, but zeal without knowledge can be a dangerous way forward and a poor way to be a light in this world. So, a Christian being indestructible. One pastor thought this was the case when he continued to hold church services in spite of all other group gatherings coming under a governor's mandate to shut down. In a news article, his justification for this was that they could not lay hands on one another if they were to do online church. Right? We're instructed to lay your hands on people, to pray for them with your hands on them. Okay, there's examples of that in Scripture. This pastor thinks that that has to be what takes place in order for God to move, so he keeps holding church. So I pose the question, is this pastor showing great faith, or is he actually showing a lack of faith? There was a centurion in the Gospels who asked Jesus to heal his daughter. The centurion told Jesus that he was not deserving to have Jesus even to come into his house. Instead, he said that Jesus could just say the word and his daughter would be healed. How did Jesus respond to this? Did he say, oh no, if I can't physically lay my hands on her, I am powerless to do anything? Did Jesus scoff at the man's weak faith? No. He expressed gratitude and determined that the man showed the greatest level of faith that Jesus had ever seen. So physical proximity is not a barrier to the intervention of Jesus. Church online is not a barrier to God's operating power. Greater faith means that you trust God that he will work through the circumstances as you're being faithful, as you're following Romans 13, submitting to your governor's authorities insofar as those mandates are not violating your biblical standards, as long as they're not causing you to compromise your faith. And they're not. And by the way, an overlooked perspective of this, why are the members of this church so easily off the hook? Right? 1,000+ people come to this man's church. Is the pastor the one to blame? Well, yeah, he's to blame as the example setter. But why are the members so easily off the hook? As if the pastor had some kind of power over them to force them to just attend. I'd be concerned at this church about a lemming mentality that all the pastor has to say is jump and everyone responds in a monotone, how high? Couldn't each of those members just say, no, you can say you're having church there on Sunday, but that doesn't mean that I'm going? This pastor got arrested. What about all the accomplices who continued to encourage this pastor by gathering around him? I get it. It's a challenge to all of a sudden shift the way that you understand doing church. And I understand the instant cancellations and the distancing standards, they seemed rather sensationalistic at first. But now that we've had the chance to take a breath, we recognize what it looks like to be a defiant U.S. citizen versus a citizen who reflects the light of Christ to the world around them. Because no government leader or official is telling you to compromise your faith or water down your message. So don't water it down. But also don't act like you are exempt from the natural spread of a virus. Your hand and my hand get burned by fire just the same. Just because you're a Christian, a faithful believer, doesn't mean you don't get wet when you walk out in the rain. You're susceptible to the same things. Okay, 4 perspectives here on the coronavirus. God did it. 100% God did it. God's responsible. The devil did it. 100% responsible. The devil. Nature did it. It's just how nature works. 100% nature. Or 4, people did it. 100% it's people. They're manipulating the good operations of things to create this. Well, I don't know if any one of these stands alone as the true perspective. God did it would imply, okay, it's not a bad thing, it's not an evil, and it's the best means for a greater good. Maybe some truth in that to those who are called according to God's purpose. It would also imply that immunity derived from overcoming this may lead to greater benefits to more human bodies. Maybe there's a benefit to the coronavirus that we don't yet see. Or maybe it's God did it in some negative terms, like God's judging worldwide greed, pride, sexual sin by inflicting the world with these hardships. And maybe when we're under these hardships and under this turmoil, God uses it to draw eyes and hearts back to him through the hardships and pain. That happens. Okay, God did it. Maybe not, though. Maybe not. Joseph Prince had an interesting 2018 prophecy or word of knowledge, word of wisdom. In this, he said that there's going to be a new strain of virus created by the devil. So according to Prince, the devil did it. The devil creates viruses. Victory Family Church agrees, and it used Luke 13:11-17 to show this. And Jesus said that Satan bound this woman for, I think, 18 years. Satan was the source of it. Doesn't mean God's using it to punish the world. Now, Prince also thought that God gives authority to believers to trample the enemy, as though God keeps the faithful from getting the virus. But this doesn't seem to be the case. There was a Seattle choir that's been in the news, a choir of 60 people. They met around March 10th or 11th. 45 of the 60 came down with the virus or symptoms that appear to be the virus. There's also been several churches, one in particular in Arkansas, that continued meeting and had an outbreak come out of that church. Okay, so even if it is of the devil, somehow people don't seem to be exempt. And what would this say if it's the devil doing it? He must have a certain sphere within which he can work. And he's trying to invent new ways to steal, kill, and destroy. That would make sense. This would be an effective way to do it. This would also imply that humans are on damage control, always trying to make up for what the devil's doing. And who's to reel in the sphere of what Satan can do? Okay, so if believers aren't exempt from this, maybe that just implies that this is a natural thing that's going on. It's part of the overall good tendency for nature to work toward good ends, although it goes wrong sometimes and people feel the pain from that. Maybe that's all it is. Nature's doing it, God's withholding his intervention in nature to let nature work its way out. And in this nature, we learn to overcome the difficulties that nature throws our way. Well, maybe people did it. Maybe it's not nature. Maybe there's actually some kind of conspiracy. Maybe somebody developed this virus in a lab to try to, control the population or wreck the world economy or some way to rise to power in the future. I don't know. Is that possible? Unlikely, in my opinion. Ineffective, in my opinion, also. But people did it may also be like an unintentional result. Maybe people had foolish interaction with animals where some of these viruses come from. Supposedly this one came from bats. So maybe there's been some unwise interaction with wild animals that has led to the virus entering human bodies. People did it. I received this DVD in the mail a year or two ago maybe. It's called Why Would a Good God Create Viruses? A sign of dysteleology, right? Teleology is the design argument for God. Dysteleology is the bad design argument against the existence of God. So if there are things like viruses in the world that wipe out populations, isn't that a sign that God did not create a well-designed world? I want to turn to an expert on this So I looked at this talk by Anjanette Roberts, or A.J. Roberts. A.J. Roberts is a scientist with reasons to believe and has earned a PhD in the study of viruses. And she takes the approach that viruses, like the rest of nature, are part of God's good creation. But it took her some time before she could realize this. In her pursuit, she asked two big questions. Where did viruses come from? How do they fit in the Christian narrative? That is, in the fall, in the redemption, in the creation. It is no wonder that most people view viruses as a horrible part of creation, even evidence of dysteleology, evidence against design. But I would argue now, through what I've heard from Anjanette Roberts, this idea of dysteleology, of bad design, is actually a very, very narrow view to have of viruses. Viruses have given the world the flu, AIDS, measles, the common cold, hepatitis, and others. In fact, we discovered viruses at least 100 years ago because of diseases that began to surface. The Spanish flu that killed at least 25 million and as many as 50 million was a virus. And the year before this video came out, Ebola killed about 11,000. Viruses existed long before these outbreaks. They were just undetected because they never caused any problems. It's kind of like electricity. You forget that it's there, working, continually doing its job until something goes wrong. Or it's like pastors in the news. You never hear about the quality of their normal work for thousands of them over thousands of days, but the news is sure to make hay about the rotten apple. The point is, a correct perspective of viruses reveals more than their very occasional pain to the human body. What are viruses? Proteins, nucleic acids. This means that viruses are strands, or a large series of strands, of genetic information. When this genetic information attaches to an already living thing, it throws new words, so to speak, into the instructions of that living thing. It's like a new command on the living thing's function and behavior. So the living thing is now slightly altered because the virus has inserted some different information. Now, almost all of the effects that viruses have on living things are in relation to bacteria. Oh no, another sign of dysteleology, right? Another sign of bad design. There's bacteria. No, there is a ton of bacteria on the planet. In fact, Roberts said that there are 100 times more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. That's not mass, that's just sheer number. And these bacteria are essential to the normal functioning of the human body. Bacteria is essential to life on Earth, and viruses are essential to bacteria. There are lots of viruses. Robert said that there are 10 to the power of 31, one with 31 zeros after it. My understanding is they haven't determined them to be anywhere else other than Earth. And yet viruses outnumber the stars or the grains of sand by 10 million times. They are so common that if you were to take a gram, a cubic centimeter, a milliliter of water, there would be in this cubic centimeter between 1 million and 10 million virus particles. 1,000 viruses stacked end to end would span across the human hair. But how far would all the viruses on this planet stack? If you were to stack them end to end, 10,000 equal one hair. You think it would go a mile? You think it'd go across the country? Around the world? To the moon? To the sun? To the nearest star? Further? To the Andromeda galaxy? Yes, and back 20 times. They are super abundant, and the vast majority are very good. All right, bacteria reproduce very fast. And this is why viruses can reproduce. Viruses don't reproduce on their own. They need to piggyback off something else that can reproduce. But why don't bacteria completely take over our body? If there's that many cells, how is there something other than bacteria? Why don't they reproduce, totally consume us? Or why don't they take over the entire world for that matter, if they can multiply so quickly? It's because of this interesting, dynamic, symbiotic relationship between viruses and bacteria. Roberts says that they depend on each other. Without viruses, bacteria would consume everything with no restraint. But if we go slightly in the other direction and lose a percentage of our bacteria, then good luck even digesting the food that keeps your engine going. And this creates quite the conundrum for naturalistic evolution. Bacteria are what they are because of viruses. But viruses cannot multiply without entering living cells like bacteria. Even though they contain genetic material, viruses aren't really living things. This balance between bacteria and viruses leaves us with the optimal, or now near optimal, balance of the two. Bacteria has not taken over the world, but there is still enough to carry out the plant functions, the animal functions, the human functions that are essential to the continuation of healthy lives on this planet. In other words, if we were to get rid of one or the other, we would be doomed. This means that you and I should be thankful, in a broad sense, for the existence of viruses and bacteria. Here's another reason that Roberts is thankful for viruses. Viruses may have a part in redemption. Roberts sees science and scientists as instruments of God's redemption. So research about viruses led to much of what we know about molecular and cell biology. Without it, we would not have come to such great advances in medicine in particular and in science in general. Viruses fight cancers and viral diseases. They fight things like the polio vaccine, which came to an immunization in 1952 and has just recently been eradicated, I think. Before that, it was used to treat smallpox. So this insertion of genetic information is only bad when the information in it is bad, but it can be used for good and can be used by humans for good. Humans can't just form this genetic information out of nothing. They must use the information that's available, the viruses and the genetics that are available, and then infuse that into something that can benefit from it. So it is a great tool in the hands of wise minds. Great, so there's a lot of useful viruses. Viruses are essential to the balance of our planet and to life. The vast majority are doing their job to sustain life round the clock. But why are there any bad ones?
So my hard drive just went full, so it stopped the recording. So picking up there, do we see dysteleology? Well, if we want to admit that, first we should be honest enough to point out the intricate design that dominates most of what we see. So here's what was going on with me a couple days ago. I was walking down the street and noticed this vibrant blooming tree. Spring has sprung in Albuquerque, and blue flowers are popping up on all parts of this tree. But if I look close enough, I can see spots where the flower didn't bloom or where it bloomed and maybe withered. Is this evidence of bad design of the tree? Do I stand back and look at the tree and say, what an ugly tree? No design here, no beauty to it here. If there is 99.99% amazing design, people often seem to focus on the 0.01%, as if the world somehow owes it to them to bring them to a percentage of 100, as far as what they think 100 should look like. I would argue that's not a reasonable way to look at the tree, and it's not a good way to admire the beauty of the creation around us, and it's not even a good way to admire the intricate design in viruses. Second, might there actually be a reason for the 0.01%? Because this is what trips people up. Why are there any bad ones if the designer is completely good? Well, Roberts suggests a couple possibilities. Maybe there's some mismanagement by humans. Maybe a human went to the tree and rubbed off one of the flowers or picked one, and that's why it's not exhibiting a flower in that particular location. And maybe in the case of viruses or other forms of human hurt, there's actually some human intervention that's come into play. Some mismanagement, some improper manipulation of the natural forces in order to bring about something that would end up being painful. Could be. Or, and I think Roberts favors this approach, maybe they're a possible part of normal decay, right? Because in the book of Genesis, you have God saying, "Cursed is the ground because of you." Now that sin has entered into the world, this cannot be the place that God has destined humanity to dwell in. Sin mars our image of God. It mars our perspective of who he is. So the ground had to be cursed to decay to make this a temporary place. To know that this viewing God through the nature of sin cannot be the ultimate place we're created for. And we get reminders of that as things decay and wear out and sometimes don't work perfectly. But we still see this overwhelming amount of good design in the world. So how does this relate to the problem of evil? Well, problem of evil goes like this. God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil exists. 3 true premises, it seems. But if God is all good, he would get rid of evil. If God is all powerful, he could get rid of evil. Yet evil exists, therefore no such God exists. But this assumes that there is no way that evil could be a part of a greater good. And we don't know whether or not this is the case until the end of the story. After all, there are numerous things that we have thought were bad or evil in the moment. But but found out later that they were necessary to our development. If we're developed for a satisfying, self-centered life on this earth only, then yes, it seems like there would be no resolution to evil, hurts, or injustice in life. But for these terms to even hold meaning, evil, hurt, injustice, what's good, what's bad, perspectives from a theistic worldview must be adapted. Unless we have a value giver who provides the objective perspective of what is good and provides the necessary grounds for what is valuable, anyone could come up with any definition of what may be considered bad, hurtful, or evil. What do we need for bad, hurts, and evil to exist in the world? You have to have good. Evil is the reduction of good. If you have a 100% standard of complete goodness, evil would be that which brings down the level of goodness. That's why the crimes that do the most to insult what is most valuable in this world are the most severe crimes. The murder, the taking of a valuable human life, the rape, robbing the dignity in the most drastic way of a human. It reduces the good. They are not creating evil out of thin air or out of nothingness. Evil must rely on the prior existence of good to even exist. It's only recognized through a comparison of what is already good. But where does this standard of good actually come from? It must be an objective standard. It must be value that's infused into the world. But if all we are is an accidental collocation of atoms, colliding particles, and natural processes, all you have is what is. You don't have any standard for what ought to be. You don't have any reasonable way to discern between what is good and what is evil, if there's not value and intention infused into the creation. So what we have is not a problem of evil for the theist, but a problem of good for the non-theist. And what we have when we look at our world, even something with the stigma of viruses, we see an overwhelming level of good and creative power and creative genius, but you have a little reduction of that. So there's a problem of objectively defining and discerning good and evil to even be able to call something like a coronavirus bad or evil. So that is where we see the reduction in the good insofar as nature has deteriorated to a point where this particular virus, which is one out of billions and billions, adversely affects humans. But there are other viruses in your body and in the world around you that leads to life as you know it to be able to thrive. Hopefully that puts things in perspective and keeps your mind focused on the good creator who cares for you and who's interested in bringing you from a place of reduction of good to a place of pure good where we can see him for who he really is. So thanks for chiming in. This is Evan Van Sickle for Curious Minds. Talk to you soon. God bless and guide you.